This cemetery happens to be very historic. It was started in around 1889, about 25 years after the Civil War ended, and it's on land that was set aside for formerly enslaved people. And this was a time when cemeteries were segregated. White and black people weren't buried together. And so churches had benevolent societies that would raise money in order to buy land so that they could have their own cemeteries, and this is one of those.
Originally, the cemetery was owned by a church out of Lockland, and unfortunately it fell into disrepair because the church didn't have adequate funds to maintain the cemetery.
This was very dangerous. The cemetery was very dangerous. There were like weeds, above my waist, and collapsed graves, and wildlife, and not a safe place for people to visit.
In addition to that, the cemetery had poor record keeping, and therefore we were unable to locate a lot of the grave sites as family members would ask where various loved ones were buried. And as a result, as they continued to bury, they unfortunately were unearthing some already existing grave sites, which, as you can imagine, caused some levels of discomfort, not for only the people that are maintaining the cemetery, but obviously for the loved ones of the people that are buried here. So the township at the time worked with the church to acquire the property. That took a lot of effort, especially from one of our previous elected officials, Gwen McFarland, who championed the effort to change state law that allowed townships to, when they took over a abandoned cemetery, which they were required to by law. However, there was nothing in the current law that enabled the township to avoid the debt or liens associated with a cemetery property. Therefore, the township had the state law changed that said when we had to acquire by default an abandoned cemetery, which this was, all of the back taxes and any liens associated with any debt associated with the property would be wiped clean before the township would take ownership of it. Because you can imagine, from a taxpayer perspective, it's one thing to inherit, a 15 to 20 acre piece of property that you have to maintain in perpetuity, but then also to potentially, in addition to the costs of doing that, have to acquire and assume the debt associated with the property wasn't something that we felt like was fair to the taxpayers of the township. Therefore, our previous Township trustee Gwen McFarland championed an effort with state legislators to change the law, and through that process, which took a better part of a year to year and a half, we were able to eventually untangle the titles associated with the property, extinguish any of the liens, and take the property over once it was abandoned by the church. And since that time, we've worked with various civil engineers to do some mapping of the cemetery so that now we have a good record of where people are buried and when. And our Public Works Department has done a phenomenal job of maintaining the property since then, I think much to the benefit, obviously, of the neighbors in the community, and more importantly, the people that are buried here and their loved ones. And then we've worked with some great volunteers.
I had some experience in doing cemetery conservation with the National Park Service, and so I got a hold of Gwen McFarland, who was a previous council member, and asked for permission to start doing some volunteer work out here, and she arranged for that to happen. So I've been doing it ever since. I'm retired from the military. I did half of my career in the Army and the other half in the Air Force. I retired in 2000 out of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and moved with my family down here to Cincinnati, and then worked for the Department of Veterans Affairs for 20 years. One of the things that's particularly significant about the cemetery is that about 10% of the graves are of veterans. And to put that in perspective, only about 2 or 3% of the U.S. population today ever wore a uniform. So these are folks that just provided a tremendous service to their country. So one of the things that we've done is tried to really concentrate on taking care of the graves of our veterans here. We've put in a flagpole that's lit at night. We've had a couple of scout troops come out and do some work, like installing semi-permanent flag holders. So now when the American Legion comes out on patriotic holidays and puts in flags, they have nice holders for them to go into. And we've done some work on restoring the headstones that are provided by the VA, and also on acquiring VA headstones for veterans that previously didn't have government-issued headstones. There are a lot of graves out here that are missing headstones in general, and we've also been able to find a number of graves where the headstones have become buried over time, and been able to dig those up and lift them and reset them properly to honor the people that are buried here. A lot of people come out and they look around and they see a lot of toppled and partially buried headstones, and they think, oh, there must be vandalism. Well, it's not vandalism. Actually, this land is basically rubble that's left from glaciers that came through here, so it's very unstable. And land is a little bit like liquid. There's a phenomenon that's called ground creep. So land will slowly move downhill even if you don't see it happening. So a lot of the headstones that are buried and toppled out here are because of ground creep. And so we can reset all of these headstones now, and they'll be good for a long time. But 50 years from now, when I'm long gone, hopefully there'll be a program in place where we can continue the maintenance and the upkeep so that the people here are properly remembered. This is still very active. This cemetery has really deep roots with the African American community in Cincinnati. Every time I come out here to do volunteer work, people are driving in to visit the graves of loved ones. And I get to interact with them. On the township website, there's a GIS locator, and I get to show them that. So if they can't find the graves of their loved ones, they can look on that and locate those graves. And they're very appreciative of all the work that the township has done to restore and conserve the cemetery. Over in the other section of the cemetery, there's a man named Carter, and he was the first black Unitarian minister, certainly in Cincinnati, but probably in this country. And he's buried right back here, and the Unitarian church that sits beside the cemetery has kind of adopted his grave. He and his wife were originally buried in unmarked graves, and they've provided a headstone for him. And behind the church, they've put up a little signpost that gives his history. Also, the last living African American member of the Women's Army Corps is buried back over here. There's also Civil War soldiers that are buried here, Mexican American War soldiers. There's members of the Pioneer Infantry from World War I that are buried here, which are kind of the precursors of what today the Seabees do in the Navy. So they saw a lot of really heavy combat, and were able to do construction missions during World War I despite the combat that they saw. So another significant person that's buried out here is Carl Westmoreland, who was the senior historian at the Freedom Center and a leader in the community in Cincinnati, community-wide, and his family are buried out here as well. So this is a headstone of a woman that was born in the 1920s. This is a marble stone, and at some point it was broken, and the top part of this was buried. And we noticed that the broken part was sticking up, so we probed the ground and we were able to find the top part of the stone. At this point, I have chipped off the remains of an old repair with Portland cement. Portland cement, unfortunately, degrades marble. It's very caustic to marble. and eventually it would have continued to damage the stone without removing it. So I've chipped that off, repaired it with a proper epoxy. And my next step will be to infill the crack and the missing parts with historic lime mortar, which will preserve it, for probably, the next century. And then it'll be cleaned. And I can show you another stone that's already undergone this process so you can see what the outcome is. So that one I found, that's a bronze marker that I found leaning against the tree over there, and it had gotten hit by ground equipment and was torn. And I took it to a blacksmith who fixed it, and then I refinished it. So this is a very interesting marker. This marker is what we refer to as a folk monument. It was made by the family of the person who was buried here, and it's made of concrete. What happened with this marker is that it has a piece of iron rod that went up through it to stabilize it. And what happens is that the iron rusts and it expands. And eventually the iron breaks the concrete or the marble or the granite or whatever it's attached to. So when we have instances like this, we have to figure out a way to prepare it without replacing it with iron. So what we're going to do with this particular monument is we're going to put it back together with epoxy and with historic lime mortar. And instead of using an iron pin to put it back together as was originally done, what we'll do is we'll build a stainless steel sleeve to go around it to hold it upright. Because it's very important historically that we preserve these kinds of markers, because they tell us a lot about the culture of the families of the folks that are buried here in the cemetery. This is still an active cemetery. If families want to have burials out here, probably the best option at this point is the columbarium, where we can inter cremains of their loved ones. If folks can prove that they have a plot here, and if we can do the research with existing records that shows that, we will do our best to accommodate a burial. But the columbarium is probably the best option at this point because of the historic nature of the cemetery. We always welcome volunteers to come out and help. That includes family members. What a lot of people don't realize is that these headstones were purchased by families, and they still belong to those families. And so it's perfectly okay for families to come out and work on and preserve and restore and reset the headstones of their family members. And I'm particularly interested in teaching people how to do that. And so they can call the township, and the township knows how to get in touch with me, and I will come out and I will teach you how to clean these stones properly using materials that won't deteriorate the stones. I will teach you how to reset the stones properly, and how to maintain them over time. We have church groups and we have scouting groups that come out and do a lot of work out here on special volunteer days. We always encourage people to do that. For example, we've helped two Boy Scouts get awarded their Eagle Scout badges with projects out here at the cemetery. This last Eagle Scout project, the Scouts came out and cleaned every headstone in this cemetery. So we're talking 5,000 plus headstones. And folks that visit will notice that they look a lot nicer. They're a lot cleaner of the mold and the mildew that tends to collect on the headstones and tends to deteriorate them over time. So keeping them clean is very important. And they've also reset and restored several monuments out here that were toppled over or that were buried or partially buried. And they've even found some headstones that were completely buried that we've been able to reset where they belong so that folks can find their family members that are buried here. I offer my services citywide to families that want their veteran stones cleaned. But a lot of families are kind of funny about their, not really funny, but they're protective of their family headstones, and they don't necessarily want them cleaned and conserved. And so it's really important before you work on another family's headstones that you consult with that family, find out what they want, what they don't want, before messing with other people's property. The government headstones, the ones that are issued by the VA, they're a little bit different. They're still owned by the government. And so as long as you have the permission of the landowner or the cemetery, or in this case the township, you can come out and work on government-issued headstones. But our preference is always that you get some training before you do that, so that you're only using chemicals that will preserve the headstone and not using things like bleach or non-pH neutral chemicals that will eventually degrade and destroy the headstones that you're trying to preserve.
A better representation of what the township would like to see when loved ones lay their relatives to rest. And I think now what we have here today, in addition to all the improvements that were made and what the volunteers have done, is a testament to what can happen when people see a need and put their minds to making sure that the result and the outcome is to the betterment of everyone, the community, the people, the families, and everyone involved.